I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet tonight, the Bunurong people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And can I, without being or sounding too patronising, say just how incredibly proud I am of you, the parents, because I know that's sort of commentary we give to students, but it is wonderful to see how many parents have responded to want to be a part of this learning and to enter this partnership. So thank you very much for that. One of the great quotes that came out of the McKinsey report that you'll know about is that no school can rise above the level of the quality of its teachers. And we have, over this last 8.5 years, really sought to make sure that our investment, and whilst it may appear from time to time that it's more in terms of bricks and mortar and play spaces, the very large majority of what we've invested in that time has really been about improving the conditions of teaching and learning. It has been about reducing the amount of teaching that our teachers do, especially across the secondary area. It's been about reducing class sizes, but it's also been about making sure that we've increased the opportunities for real quality in terms of professional learning. And in terms of looking to how we do that and how we extend that program, I know that in looking around, I was fortunate a few years ago to go to the Future of Learning at Harvard. And it came at a time when we were trying to find somewhere within Australia a model for professional learning that we thought could take us to that next level. And the reality was that we really couldn't find it. We thought at the same time about, do we invest in some type of institute, as we've seen at a number of schools? But I would suspect that a lot of that investment has been very narrow. And so very fortunate in terms of being joined by Jackie Coker, who'd also had that same experience of being the Future of Learning. And it became very evident to us that we weren't going to find it here, nor were we going to find it just by instilling or putting somebody into a position within the college. We considered 2 universities which seemed to be offering something that we thought of high quality. One was Cambridge and one was Harvard. And as an Englishman, can I tell you, Ron, it was very disappointing that it was Harvard. But we live with these things. And so that sort of journey started. And it's been a 3-year journey of Ron's involvement with the college, who's now impacted upon more than 80 of our staff, which includes all of our academic leadership teams right across the college, but also many of those aspirational young leaders to make sure we're nurturing and developing and enriching at a much higher level. It's interesting that when teachers come out of that experience, whether they are early entry teachers or whether they are very experienced teachers, that almost to a person, the expressions they used, it is the very best professional learning that they believe they have ever had at any time. And so that, I think, is an incredible endorsement of the work that you do. I think we may already be observing some of the impact, because I know that when I came here 8.5 years ago, the number of students who were prepared to take on the additional challenges of IB, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that that makes it more academic, but we know it's more rigorous. But we had 31 or 32 children each of those years. Next year, we're going to see 66 children in year 10 who've indicated they intend to study the IB, more than doubling those numbers. And I think what that's come about is because of that richness that's coming into the classroom in terms of that development. We're going to continue that as well in terms of at principal level. I'm involved with a group of 9 other Australian principals from New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria in leading learning that matters. And that culminates this year. And what I'm hopeful of is it will continue with some work that we hope to be able to be engaged with the OECD that covers the future of learning and talks about 2030. For those of you, has anyone got prep children here? Fantastic, because when you work this through, what you know is that 2030 is their year 12 year. And so when we think about it and we think it's a long way off, those of us who've had children that go through realise it's going to go very quickly. And what will that future be like? What is it that we think that is going to really matter? And so what I'd like you to think about is beyond just this near horizon as parents. And I'd like you to start thinking about the horizon as grandparents. Because when we look across and we listen to all of the information about the state of education in Australia and how terrible it is because of things like PISA or NAPLAN, can I say that those things don't worry me at all? What worries me most is that we're moving into what I've termed with the staff as something of a perfect storm. Because what we know is that in the next 5 to 6 years, a very high percentage of the educational leaders in the country reach retirement age. When we look at the profile of those teachers that teach in the maths sciences, we know that a disproportionate number of those are about to hit retirement age as well. There are something like, I think it's 90,000 students who will commence in Victorian schools in the next 5 years. And what we're finding already is it's becoming remarkably difficult to find the quality of teachers to make sure that we can continue the educational standards that I think that we have become accustomed to. And there is a great challenge there for schools. But why there's a perfect storm is that beyond our shores there are other forces at work. Sounds like some evil part of some twist, doesn't it? But the reason I say that is that we know that there's about 283,000 teachers in this country at the moment. And when we go looking for teachers, we seek them not just here, but in other countries around the world. What we know is the international school system is about to expand at a very high level. And there is a view that there's going to be the requirement of an extra 220,000 English-speaking teachers to fill those jobs in the next 10 years in international schools around the world. So think about that. Britain would indicate that they are short in terms of quality teachers, top end, maths and sciences. We're hearing the same thing coming out of the major English educational speaking centres. And yet what we know is there is something like 220,000 extra teachers that are going to be required in those same environments in international settings. There is something that we have to do as a nation beyond just what we're here to do tonight. So I'm sending you away with a bit of a throwaway about things that I would like you to consider and about what it is that we want for our grandchildren, not just for our children. Because I do believe that there are some incredible concerns about the future. But coming back to the present, I could say that is why we are so fortunate to have Ron with us here this evening. He directs the Cultures of Thinking project. He's also a fellow at the Melbourne University. But what I'm most impressed about is a maths teacher. And it is wonderful to see maths teachers entering into this zone. But also, and I think very modestly he wouldn't tell you, he has had the Presidential Award for the teaching of mathematics, which is the highest honour that you can extend to a teacher right across the educational system in the United States of America, which is indeed a wonderful acknowledgement of his ability. Can I acknowledge also the books that certainly have helped to guide my thinking in terms of cultures, making learning visible, and also intellectual character. But a new one, and I haven't read, which I understand is Making Numbers Make Sense, and I look forward to learning more about that. Would you please make Ron welcome? Thank you very much.
This evening, I've organized my talk around kind of three big questions for us to explore together. So the first question here is thinking about why is it that we need to transform schools into cultures of thinking? Why is that an important goal? The second one is to kind of unpack that for you. What are some of the key practices that we employ to develop a culture of thinking? And then finally, I want to kind of end the talk this evening giving you some very specific strategies that you can use as parents to help and support your child's learning and thinking. Just a kind of little bit of background about kind of where these ideas have come from. I've been a researcher at Harvard for over 20 years. And originally, this research and these ideas came from my studying of teachers who were really adept at getting students to think, really good at developing their habits of mind, their thinking dispositions. I spent a year in those classrooms really understanding what those teachers did. So my research has always been grounded in best practice. Then went to Europe, working there in Sweden and in Northern Europe at international schools, and in 2005 coming to Melbourne where we worked at Bialik College in a research project for some 13 years. At the same time, I was engaged in a big research project in the state of Michigan that was originally funded by Dow Chemical. And at the outset of that project, I had an opportunity to meet with the CEO to secure funding for the project. And she told me a story. She said, here at Dow Chemical, we have an internship program for secondary students. We get the absolute best and brightest students. She said, but we've noticed something. We give these young people a problem to solve in the lab, and it's not too long before they give up. And they come to us and they say, well, what's the answer? And we have to explain to them, in the real world of chemistry, you don't work on problems you know the answer to. So she said, as important as chemistry is, and she says, we're Dow Chemical, we need people that know their chemistry. She said, it's not enough. We need students who can problem solve, who can persevere, who can innovate, who can collaborate. And they felt that schools had become too narrowly focused on just preparing kids to pass tests. And again, they were very clear. We need them to know their chemistry. We need them to understand it at a deep level. but we need more. So they were very interested in funding our research there because they wanted to expand the view of education. So when we talk about a culture of thinking, we are talking about deep understanding of the content area. We are talking about helping students to perform very well, but we're talking about more. So to begin with, and thinking about why culture matters, I'd like for you to consider what, to my mind, is one of the most fundamental questions in education. It's a question that all educators have to be asking themselves, all schools, all parents, all community members, all policymakers. And that question is, what do we want the students we teach to be like as adults? So we're always concerned these days with outcomes. Well, this is an outcome question. It's just a different kind of outcome question. Could you take a moment and just kind of jot down a few ideas for yourself? You can do this on your phone if you want, if you got a pencil, something to write with, but jot down just a couple of quick responses there to that prompt. What is it that you want when you think about the children that we collectively teach, that we collectively are trying to grow into adults? What do you want for them to be like as adults? Just jot down a couple of ideas. If you have a couple of responses there, we're going to do something called a thinking routine, and this thinking routine is called Give One, Get One. And the way this works, is in just a moment I'll ask you to stand up and turn to the person sitting next to you, or behind you, or in front of you, and you're going to give them one of the ideas you wrote down. But when you do that, you're going to explain, why do you care about that? Why is that an important thing for children to grow into as adults? And then they will repeat the process. They'll give you one of their ideas. So I'd like for you to do this twice. So have two very quick conversations with people around you in which you give them one idea, they give you one idea. So it's possible in your list and when you were talking with your partner that maybe perhaps some of these ideas came up. And this isn't really meant to be a list, more just kind of a sampling. These qualities, some of these often come up and many more. And the way we refer to these is, we often talk about these as being dispositions. And a disposition is a part of a person's character. It's a part of who he or she is becoming. Some of these items on the list too, and perhaps some on yours, you might hear people talking about today as 21st century skills, which I always think is a little bit disingenuous because none of these things were invented in the 21st century. They've been around for a very long time. They're just becoming more important, I think, in the world today. Another framing that you hear is sometimes these are referred to in the research as soft skills, which is another framing that I actually don't care for because the research on soft skills shows that having these kinds of attributes are actually the best markers of success. They are good markers of success both academically as well as in life. So if these are the things that actually lead to success, we should be calling them that. We should be calling them success skills rather than soft skills. My favorite way, though, of talking about these comes from Ted Sizer, who had been a dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He was instrumental in the founding of the research group that I work with, Project Zero. And he used to talk about these as the residuals of education. And I kind of love that framing. If you remember from your long division days, when you do a long division, you've got something left over remaining. Sometimes that's referred to as a residual. So for us to think about, what is it that remains with students after they have left a school? What is it that stays with them 1 year out, 3 years out, 5 years out? And to my mind, that is the mark of a quality education. So if we are trying to truly educate our students, we have to not just educate for the short term, but also for the long term. We have to think about what is it that will stay with them. But when we look at any of these qualities, and I guess anything on your list, I expect, none of them can be directly taught. You know, you can't do, say, a 6-week unit on curiosity and then bam, everyone would become curious. It's not going to work. So if we care about these and they can't be directly taught, the question that naturally emerges is, well, how do we as parents, how do we as a school help students to get there? And the answer to that is through enculturation. Now, my father is 90 years old, and he read my most recent book. He said, "You made that word up, didn't you?" I had to assure him that I hadn't. You can see the word culture there in the middle. So enculturation means to learn through the culture. But my favorite way of kind of encapsulating what that word means, there's a famous quote from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky, and that quote is, "Children grow into the intellectual life around them." So as both parents and as a school, we have to think about what kind of intellectual life are we surrounding our students with? Do they see us taking risks and learning from mistakes? Do they see our passion and curiosity? Do they see us collaborating with other people? Do they see our problem solving? So students aren't going to develop those skills on their own. They will grow into them by being in a culture in which they can see the adults and see other students and see the community actually engaged in that process. So when we talk about a culture of thinking, this is the definition that we use in our project. So we say that cultures of thinking are places. So they aren't limited to schools or classrooms. And in fact, we can think about a family unit as being a culture of thinking. So cultures of thinking are places in which the group's collective as well as individual thinking is valued, it's visible, and it's actively promoted as part of the regular day-to-day experience of all group members. So those bold words there, valued, visible, and actively promoted. So I want to kind of do some kind of unpacking of those words in terms of what they mean. When we talk about thinking being valued, I've never been to a school that says, oh, we don't value thinking here. What is more common is they say, oh, of course we do. But if you really value something, you have to be able to articulate, well, what is it specifically that you are trying to nurture and value and support? So when we think about the kinds of thinking that are really important, and in particular important in schools, we think the kinds of thinking that will lead to understanding is particularly important. The research on understanding and thinking about what it means to teach for understanding has been one of the things that Harvard has really kind of led the way at. Some 20 years ago, the Spencer Foundation funded one of the largest research projects in the world at the time to really develop a pedagogy of understanding. So we've spent a lot of time trying to understand what is involved in developing understanding. And we identified what we call 8 thinking moves. And you have a copy of this in the handout that you were given when you walked in today. So as we were developing this, the test for ourselves was, well, could you say you have understanding if you haven't engaged in this? So we were trying to identify the kinds of thinking that seemed to be necessary for understanding. So we said the idea of describing what's there, being able to see and notice. So if there's something you understand, you can identify the various parts and pieces and aspect of that thing. You are able to look and to see and notice more as a result of your understanding. And far from being simple, the ability to see and notice in any field is one of the ways we tend to recognize expertise. So we expect that our doctors can look at x-rays and see and notice things we can't because of their expertise. So that developing that ability is important for our understanding. Asking questions and wondering. You could easily imagine times and come up with lots of examples about when you have gained knowledge and information without asking any questions at all. You can sit and listen to something, you can read something, you can get information and knowledge without any questions. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to imagine a time that you actually developed understanding without asking any questions. Because those questions are what lead us into the topic and what take us further rather than just sit at that informational level. Looking at things from different viewpoints, making connections, building explanations, 3 things that really go to the heart of what it takes to build understanding. So if there's an issue that we are trying to understand and we've only looked at that issue from a single perspective, we recognize that our understanding is limited, that having other perspectives begins to round out our understanding. Oftentimes when we're trying to understand something, we are trying to build an explanation of it, build an interpretation of it, develop a theory around it. And as we're doing that, we're also making connections, which again is one of the hallmarks of understanding. And in fact, one of the ways that people talk about the difference between knowledge and understanding is connected knowledge. So you can have bits of knowledge that sit in isolation, but when you develop understanding, you are connecting that knowledge. And that's one of the reasons why it is so powerful to teach for understanding, because it doesn't neglect knowledge at all, but it helps students develop the connections which serve them well. Those connections aid to our retention, and they aid to our ability to apply and to use our knowledge. So the best preparation for test, the research has shown, whether the tester, low-level test or not, is always understanding, because it's going to aid retention and it's going to aid transfer. As we are building our explanations, we are using the evidence in front of us, the information, the data, and using that to reason and to build those explanations. The idea of uncovering complexity is the idea that understanding requires depth. It is not surface level, but we go deeply when we are trying to understand something. And finally, the idea of capturing the heart and forming conclusions, which sounds like a very concluding task, and it is, but the way our minds work is our minds are constantly engaged in that process of thinking about, what is this now? How do I understand this now? So we are constantly trying to distill the essence of the things we are trying to understand. So we said that these 8 thinking moves seem to be necessary for understanding. So that's the part of valuing thinking. And so the teachers here at St. Leonard's are really trying to make sure that in all of their lessons, they are aware of, well, what is the thinking we need students to do with this content? And sometimes as parents, when we want to help our child to develop their understanding, when we want to help them with their homework, it's not just helping them with the work, but it's helping them to develop their understanding. And this can be useful to us as parents to begin to think about, well, what kind of thinking might help to unlock this understanding that might help my child go further? What you'll also notice is that with each kind of thinking, there's a question. And we wrote those questions in the simplest, most generic form we could, and we considered those just starter questions. But we need lots of questions as adults to help children develop their thinking around that. So we could take any of those kinds of thinking. Say we take the idea of making connections, and with that, we might generate a whole host of questions that we might ask that would help facilitate that kind of thinking. Could you take just 1 minute now, and with a person just sitting next to you, look at the understanding map, pick one of those kinds of thinking, and see if the two of you can generate a few questions that you might ask that would help to facilitate that kind of thinking. So just pick one on there, just play around with coming up with some questions. So having identified the kind of thinking we value, the kind of thinking we're trying to promote, then the question is, well, how is it that we can make that kind of thinking visible? Because thinking is something that happens individually, it happens in an individual's mind, and it is an invisible process. But as adults, as parents, as teachers, we want to make that thinking visible so that we get a window into what's going on. And a key way that we make thinking visible is through what we call thinking routines. And we did one, that give one, get one was a thinking routine. The idea of thinking routines emerged from that research I did in classrooms where teachers were really effective at getting students to think. What I saw was these teachers never once taught a thinking skills lesson. Instead, they had routines and structures which they used to support and scaffold their students' thinking. A couple of years ago, we produced a short video to kind of explain what thinking routines are. So we'll watch that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them.
What can we as educators do to help students become better thinkers? One might assume that a good place to start is to teach thinking skills, but is teaching skills enough? We often miss opportunities to use the skills we have simply by not noticing times when they might be useful. Good thinkers not only know how to think creatively, critically, and deeply, they actually do it. They have a repertoire of thinking moves to draw on, they're inclined to use them, and they're sensitive to the times when thinking would be helpful. In other words, they're in the habit of observing, analyzing, and questioning. So can we teach this? Researcher educators at Project Zero have been exploring this question for many years and think the answer is yes. The thinking routines they have developed as part of their research invite learners of any age to be close observers, to organize their ideas, to reason carefully, and to reflect on how they're making sense of things. These routines are flexible enough to be used to engage learners with any artifact, system, or concept, including their own thought processes. Thinking routines are simple structures, for example, a set of questions or a short sequence of steps that can be used alone or with a group. They are designed to be easy to remember, practical, and to invite a broad range of thinking moves. They are well suited to leverage the power of collaborative thinking and transfer easily to any context. You can use them without training or prior experience, figuring out how they work along with your students just by using them. Thinking routines help students go beyond the superficial, inviting them to dig deeper by making the complex accessible. Through practice, learners become sensitive to opportunities to use their thinking moves in the wild, helping them to develop habits of mind that will sustain their curiosity inside and outside the classroom. Given the broad range of thinking routines available, it might be tempting to try out as many routines as possible. But this approach can turn them into mere strategies, subverting a core aspect of their design, that they get used over and over again. Choosing one core thinking routine, for instance, see, think, wonder, and trying it out in as many contexts as possible is more likely to reveal the ways thinking routines can support individuals in developing habits of thinking and groups in developing a culture of thinking together. Once you and your students get comfortable with the idea of using a routine for structuring your thinking, it's easier to branch out and find routines that fit well with the kind of thinking you'd like to invite. For instance, asking deep questions, making connections, coming up with explanations, challenging those explanations, and exploring alternative perspectives. Thinking routines might at first seem too simple, but it is their simplicity that makes them easy to remember and to use. Rather than simplifying ideas, thinking routines offer straightforward ways to sustain learners in their inquiry into complex problem spaces. While it does take time, using thinking routines in your classroom cultivates a community of thinkers with a culture of thinking, supporting learners in becoming intentional in their shared pursuit of deep understanding.
Yeah, so one of the routines that was mentioned there was the routine See, Think, Wonder. And so I want to tell a couple of quick stories about that really kind of demonstrate the power of thinking routines, even though they are quite simple. So at the Harvard Medical School, they recognized that one of the challenges that doctors in training had was learning to give good clinical diagnoses. So they ran an experiment in which they invited these doctors in training to spend 10 weeks, one day each week, at the Museum of Fine Arts, using the routine See, Think, Wonder to look at art. So they looked at art, got used to really noticing very carefully, beginning to make interpretations from what they noticed, and beginning to raise questions. After those 10 weeks, they tested all of the students on their clinical diagnosis skills and found that by using See, Think, Wonder, by looking at art, that those students were actually much improved on that. So a structure like that, beginning to think about how is it we see, how is it we notice and think from that, really has its payoff. It's one of the most used routines. Another example of that same routine, a colleague of mine at Project Zero, a couple of years ago, her sister became very ill. And she had to fly across the country to be with her sister who lived in California. And her sister was so ill that my colleague had to make all of the medical decisions for her. And she told me, she said, I was getting really frustrated because I didn't feel like I was getting the information from the doctors that I needed to actually make these life and death decisions that were very important. And she said, at one point, I found myself in a conference room with 3 or 4 doctors. And she said, without even thinking, I found myself saying, could you just tell me what you're seeing? And then the doctors began to explain what they were seeing. And what does that make you think? And then they began to explain their interpretation. But what are you still wondering? And they raised their wonderings. And she said, the simple routine gave me all of the information I needed to make those decisions. The doctors there didn't even know that routine, but she used that to make their thinking visible to her so that she could go forward and make those decisions. One last example about thinking routines, a classroom example to see how this actually looks in a classroom. This is a year 10 maths class from the International School of Amsterdam. The teacher here, Emily Slyman, talking about how she uses a routine called Chalk Talk, which doesn't use chalk, uses text instead, how she uses that to make her students' thinking visible.
I found that I became much more intentional, both in my teaching and in my language. More and more, I found myself wondering, what are my students thinking right now, and what do I want them to be thinking right now? This was a Chalk Talk that was done in conjunction with two other Chalk Talks, two other questions in the same Chalk Talk period. I was trying to do a pre-assessment of my students to see what they had learned in their previous classes, what they already knew about triangles and trigonometry. Students in my class have used Chalk Talk before, and they're getting more and more familiar with it. And one of the things I've been emphasizing with them is to try and make connections with each other and with different groups. So in this case, one group had green markers, one had black, one had blue. And you can see from the arrows that they are starting to make connections with each other and across thought ideas. As they went around as well, this one was about scaling triangle, but they also had one about trigonometry and the right triangle. And they made connections back to those as well as they circled. Here it's interesting how students said, I wanted to write this, but I forgot the actual formula. You have agreement in green, but then someone in blue making the connection. I already wrote this on the right triangle one. Someone else says, no, that's with all triangles. And over here, someone else has filled in the formula that the person writing in black had forgotten. So what we're really seeing on this is the students beginning to think together, and the interactions with the different colored markers or the different groups and the different handwritings. You can see them making comments to each other and supporting each other as they think through the scaling triangle.
So at this point, as researchers, we've created over 40 different thinking routines, and it's not that teachers use all of those, but they become tools, and they aren't activities that we do in the classroom, but we think about thinking routines as an opportunity to make the thinking routine. So by using these structures, students are scaffolded and supported in their thinking, and the thinking becomes more visible both to them as well as to us as teachers. When we talk about then how is it we actively promote thinking? We do that by creating really powerful learning opportunities for students. And in our research and drawing on research from a few other sources, we've identified 4 really important ingredients to making learning opportunities powerful for students. So the first one is the idea of novel application. So we need to put students in situations where they are applying their skills in new situations. And this is really important because then they are learning to transfer, and they are learning how those skills might actually be applied. A complement to that is that we also have to make sure that there's meaningful inquiry going on, meaning that students are actually learning something new at the same time. So as you can imagine, we can certainly put students in a situation where they are applying their skills, but they may not be learning something new. We want both of those things to happen. So they are both practicing the skills they have, applying those in new situations at the same time that they are learning something new. And then a third is effective communication. So that students are learning to communicate their ideas, their thinking. They are learning to use the language of the discipline. So how is it we communicate in math? How is it we communicate in science, in history, in language, in art? And learning those disciplinary techniques and forms. And then finally, the idea of perceived worth, so that students feel that what they are doing is worthwhile. It has meaning and purpose for them. I said that these ideas kind of draw on some other research in addition to research that we've done at Harvard. And specifically, they draw on some research by a professor, Fred Newman, at the University of Wisconsin. And one of the things that he did a fascinating study several years ago that answered a question that teachers all over the world have. And that question is the best way to prepare kids for standardized tests to spend your time preparing kids for standardized tests? And the answer was no. What he found was when students are in classrooms in which they regularly encounter powerful learning opportunities, that is the best preparation, even when it is a low-level test of just knowledge and skills. Because what that is doing is it's giving students the ability to transfer their skills, constantly learning something new, being used to challenge, and seeing that learning is something that is worthwhile. We're going to finish up here now, kind of specifically talking about some things that you as parents can do. And I've kind of labeled this portion of the talk 9 apps for parents. But when I talk about these apps, that's just kind of a device I'm using to talk about. You can't go to the iStore and download this. So we will be doing these apps virtually. So the first one here, walking through them. I did spend a lot of time on this graphic, though, I will let you know that. So the first one here, N squared. So this stands for notice and name. So one of the things that we as adults do and help to promote thinking is we notice and name the thinking. So even from a very young age, a student makes a contribution. We say, that's a really interesting connection you just made. That's a great prediction. We add the language onto it. So we notice and name and highlight the thinking and thus draw attention to it. And that's one of the ways that students develop their metacognitive abilities, their awareness of their own thinking and the strategies they have at their disposal. This next one stands for the growth mindset. And this comes from the research by Carol Dweck. And Carol Dweck, as a young researcher, thought that what she was interested in studying was she thought she was really interested in studying how people deal with failure. And so she created these tasks in which she had different puzzles, and she would give people puzzles, and they would constantly get harder and harder. And what she planned to do was to make them hard enough that people would eventually fail and to see what happened and how they dealt with that failure. Not everyone failed. Now, she made sure that puzzles were hard enough that people couldn't solve them. But when some people couldn't solve them, they didn't view it as a failure. They viewed it as an opportunity to learn. So then she became fascinated. Why is it that some people don't view this as a failure, but view it as an opportunity to learn? And what she found was it is the way people think about intelligence. Do they think about intelligence as something you can grow and develop? Or do they think intelligence is just something that is fixed and set, something that you have? So of course, once she kind of hit on that the way people view intelligence makes a big difference, then she wanted to think about, well, what is it that causes people to develop this growth mindset versus a fixed mindset? And what she found was the way that people are praised by parents and by teachers has a lot to do with whether they will develop a fixed or a growth mindset. When students were praised for ability, then that's praising their intelligence. You're so smart, you're really clever, you're just good at this. But when people are praised for their effort, you worked really hard and you applied what you knew, and that's where your success came from, so you can do that next time, those people developed more of a growth mindset. So back to those puzzle problems. She did an experiment in which she gave one group that ability praise. You're so good at this. You are just a natural-born puzzle solver. Other people, you worked really hard. Look how you took what you learned from the last puzzle and you applied that to here and you were successful. Praise them for their effort. After that, then she said, I've got 2 other stacks of puzzles here. This one stack, these are a little bit harder than what we've just been doing. They're a lot harder. They're kind of challenging. And these are about the same as what we've been doing. Which one would you like? The people that just were told they are so smart, they are so clever, they are just good at puzzle solving, picked the easy stack. Because when you praise ability, you are praising the ego. And so then people engage in ego protection. This adult just thinks I'm really clever, so I want them to keep thinking that. So I better choose the easy one so I'm sure that they'll still think I'm good. Because if I choose those hard ones and I fail, they're going to say, oh, you weren't so good after all. The people that were praised for effort chose the challenging stack. Then she sent them off to a room by themselves, said, oh, would you record? Would you record how you do? There was a hidden camera in the room. Again, both stacks were actually the same. So they're writing down, and what they found was the students that were praised for their ability cheated on their recording. Another ego protection device. I want this person to think I'm really good. And so they cheated. But the people that were praised for their effort cheated less, if not at all. And these studies were repeated in lots of different cultures because actually a TV station in Korea got, read about this and were fascinated and wondered if this was kind of a cultural thing, just a Western thing, and they repeated it there, found the exact same results. So as parents, thinking about how we praise our child, praising them for the effort, what they have done, and it's not just good job, better luck next time. It's, look how you learned, how you can carry that forward, that they need a learning-oriented response so they can see how their efforts will contribute to their success. The next one, this has to do with challenges, and I mentioned a little bit about challenge in Carol Dweck's work, but learning occurs at the point of challenge. So we have to help children get comfortable with challenge. So when things are not coming easily, we don't want them to give up. We want them to see, that's actually good. We don't need them to be frustrated, because once you're frustrated, learning drops right off. But to recognize, if you're just being challenged and you're being pushed a little bit, that's a sign that you are learning. That's great. If things are coming easily for you, you are just practicing things you already know how to do. So to help our students recognize challenge is a symbol of learning, not a symbol of difficulty. The next one here is the importance of questions, and we talked a little bit about questions in relationship to the understanding map, but the story that I want to tell you here is a story of a Nobel Prize winner, Isidore Rabi. And Isidore Rabi several years ago won the Nobel Prize in Physics. And when he won the award, the New York Times sent a reporter to interview him. And one of the questions the New York Times reporter asked was, how in the world did you become a scientist? You grew up in an immigrant household in the Bronx. No one on your street was a scientist. Your family members weren't scientists. No one in your neighborhood was a scientist. How in the world did you become a scientist? And he said, that's easy. He said, when all the other kids came home from school, their mothers asked them what they did. When I came home from school, my mother asked me, Izzy, did you ask any good questions today? That's what made me a scientist. So encourage your child to ask questions, because that passion, that curiosity is what will drive them for a lifetime. This next one stands for the difference between work and learning. As parents and as teachers, we always want to make sure that children are learning. And sometimes children can look at an assignment or a task and they can approach it as, this is just work to be done. And if they are doing that, they are probably missing the learning. And as parents, it's easy to fall into the trap, through no fault of our own, as being monitors of the work, because our child comes home and we say, what's your homework? What do you have to do? Is your homework done? Can I see? Are you done? So we become monitors of the work. But teachers don't deliberately assign work. They think there's learning there. Again, the problem occurs if your child is just doing it as stuff to get done, then they're probably missing the learning. So I would encourage you to add one additional question. You can still ask, what's your homework? What do you have to do? But then ask them, and what do you think your teacher wants you to learn from that? That will reorient them on where the learning is and where the focus needs to be. Here, I'm going to encourage you to let your child argue with you. Okay? Now, that may not be much of a stretch. But the reason for this, in 2015 in the Journal of Adolescence, a study was reported looking at what are some of the things that made young people resilient and resistant to peer pressure, particularly around delinquent behavior, the use of drugs and other kinds of delinquent behavior. And what they found was that children that came from households in which they were supported in arguing a case, not being argumentative, but arguing a case, putting forth a position, trying to persuade through reason and arguments, were able to take those same skills into a peer situation. So then when a peer presented doing something that was wrong, they had the ability to refute that and say, no, let's not do this because another reason. But children that came through more dogmatic households where they just were told, no, just do it because I said so. Then when their peers say, let's just do it because I say so, they went along with it. So that ability, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with your child, that you're still the decider in your household. So you can say, nope, not a good argument, not persuaded. But that ability to put forth reasons and to try to make a case and try to persuade someone is a highly transferable skill that will serve them in good stead. This is the importance of time, and we are learning so much more about the importance of unstructured time in children's lives. That it is through unstructured time, particularly in early childhood, that children learn to develop creativity, that children learn to deal with boredom, that children learn to become self-regulated learners because they have to begin to make decisions. But when every decision is made for them, they don't learn those skills. We are also learning the importance, and when I say unstructured time, that also means time away from devices. So we have to limit the amount of time our children are on there so that they learn to engage their minds, they learn to make decisions around that. So make sure your child has some unscheduled time in which they are making their own decisions about how to fill up that time, how to use that time. That's when they will develop their curiosity, their creativity, and their passions. This one stands for make your own thinking visible. So as an adult, when you are thinking, when you are making decisions, make that visible so your child sees how you go through that process. When you make a mistake and when you reflect on that, make that visible so they see how you think. Because again, we grow into the intellectual life around us. So we need to see the adults in our life, how they think in that process. Share with them the things that you are curious and passionate about, the things that capture your interest. And this last one, this is an acronym. It stands for What Makes You Say That? This is also a thinking routine. It's one of the first thinking routines we developed when we were working in Sweden. And the Swedish teachers took to calling this the magic question. Because they said, all we have to do is ask that, what makes you say that? And all of a sudden, all these wonderful things happen. They said, the thinking is just amazing and we find out so much more about our students. There was a teacher at one of the schools I work with here in Australia who said, that what makes you say that? She said, that's not just for the classroom. She says, that's how I live my life now. She said, I used to be really shy at like cocktail parties and things. And I found if you just listen to people and you say, well, what makes you say that? All of a sudden, all this interesting stuff comes up and you sound so smart and clever. And she said, I used to get into all these fights with my husband. And I found if I just don't say anything and say, what makes you say that? The stuff he was saying was completely different from what I was hearing. So he said, it saved my marriage. So he said, that what makes you say that? She says, I'm a believer in that. But if you start using what makes you say that with your child, don't be surprised if they start using it back on you. Yeah. So with those apps and working together, we can create really powerful learners and thinkers. So thank you.